On the 15th of April 1989, thousands of football supporters made the journey from Liverpool and Nottingham to Sheffield Wednesday's Hillsborough Stadium. Tragically, 97 Liverpool supporters did not return. 27 years after the disaster, a jury concluded that these supporters were unlawfully killed. Now, 35 years on from that fateful day, many survivors of the disaster are still feeling the effects. On a sunny Saturday afternoon in April 1989, thousands of Liverpool and Nottingham Forest supporters made their way to Sheffield for the semi-final of the FA Cup. The fixture was a repeat of the previous year's semi-final that had taken place at the same ground. In 1988, Liverpool had celebrated victory, but on the 15th of April 1989, there would be no celebrations for anyone involved. The day started like any other FA Cup semi-final would have, with supporters making their way to the ground by coach, train and car. Most supporters would have been laughing with their friends and family, having kissed their mums goodbye, and said to anyone who wasn't heading to the match, "See you after the game." For nearly 100 unwitting Liverpool supporters, this would be the last time they would see their loved ones. As the 3 p.m. kick-off neared and supporters started to head to the ground, problems started to emerge. Just like the previous year, Liverpool had been allocated the Leppings Lane end of the stadium. As many people approached the ground, they found it to be very busy. However, for some, this may not have been a concern for such a big match. At 2:30 p.m, match commander David Duckenfield radioed officers outside of the ground, questioning whether all of the Liverpool supporters would make it inside before kick-off. 10 minutes later, a crush had started to develop outside of the turnstiles. At 2:51, there were pleas from police over the radio to open a gate at the Leppings Lane end to prevent injury to fans outside of the turnstiles. A minute later, a senior officer warned that there was a risk of death if the gates were not opened. Duckenfield then ordered Gate C to be opened. More than 2,000 fans came through the gate, with many making their way down the tunnel straight ahead of them and into pens 3 and 4 of the Leppings Lane terrace. The match kicked off at 3 p.m. as planned. At 3 minutes past 3, the density of people in pen 3 was estimated to be about 10 people per square metre. Fans could already be seen on the pitch and climbing the fence to get out of the pens. At 4 minutes past 3, Liverpool's Peter Beardsley hit the crossbar of the goal. This caused a surge forward. At 3:06, the match was stopped. Fans flooded onto the pitch and it became apparent that something was majorly wrong. 97 people died as a result of the Hillsborough disaster. For many people that were at Hillsborough that day, both supporting Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, the last 35 years have been difficult. Paul is from Formby and was just 18 when he was at Hillsborough.
We travelled by coach with one of the club official coaches over to Sheffield. Got there nice and early. It was a hot sunny day. Knew lots of people that were going, so we went. We had a drink before going in, and we got down to the ground quite early and got in probably about 2 o'clock. By which time it was already very, very busy in there, and didn't feel as though there was a lot of control over people going in. On the coach, I was with a friend of mine called Tim. We were sat next to each other travelling over, and then once we got over to Sheffield, there was probably a group of about half a dozen or so friends that were all there. It was very, very busy. We were right in one of the central pens. As you sort of went in through the turnstile, you saw ahead of you the central tunnel that went down to the pens. And although I later find out that there are side entrances to the side pens, they weren't particularly obvious. Very, very hot because it was a hot sunny day. And with that many bodies in there, it felt, really the heat in there was quite intense. Leading up to a game, you're singing, you're cheering, and then it just starts getting too uncomfortable. But at that stage, there's nothing you can really do about it because it's so packed that there was nowhere that you could go.
By that time I was quite experienced on the terraces, but it was already overcrowded then. you'd find yourself getting flung from side to side, because when it's overcrowded, every movement creates a counter movement, and so it was overcrowded, but I didn't feel frightened. It didn't occur to me that it was dangerous until just after the players came out.
Liverpool hit the bar very, very early on, and there was that sort of excitement around that, but at the same time it was starting to become aware that it wasn't right around you. At that point there was quite a big surge coming from behind us, and Tim, who I was with, we were sort of behind a crash barrier. I actually got caught on the end of the crash barrier, and Tim missed that barrier, and he sort of disappeared off into the crowd of people. I can remember at the time, I thought, oh, he'll be back in a minute, and getting stuck on this barrier is the last thing that I want, because you've got all the weight coming in behind you, but actually in hindsight that barrier is probably what saved me.
I was flung forward, and normally there are surges in the crowd, the space comes back to you. This time I was stuck tight, and it just it never receded, and within 30 seconds, a minute, you start to actually feel frightened. The thing about being in a crush like that is you've got no outlet for any of your fear. I mean, you can't run, you can't struggle, and because you can't breathe, you can't scream or shout, so there's no outlet for your fear. It's just overwhelming, and you're looking at the police on the perimeter track, and they're not slightest bit interested.
It was in the time, sort of in the late 80s, where football hooliganism was prevalent and things like that. You knew that it wasn't a pitch invasion. You knew that it wasn't crowd trouble. It was something different to that. Initially, you could see the police didn't click to that, and they were trying to push the gates shut again. But actually the crowds were forcing the gates open and out and onto the pitch. Probably took me about 20 minutes from that point to actually get to the front and safely out onto the pitch. Probably by about 3:30 I got onto the pitch. And that was up through the front of the stand.
I just started to think about, I would never say goodbye to family and friends and whatnot. I began to slip away. Eventually the gate in the fence was open, and they did start to pull people out, but I thought it was too late for me. I could feel myself slipping away, and I lost consciousness. And when I was unconscious, it was like I was travelling down a road, and when I get to the end of the road, I'll wake up, but the road just kept stretching. I was unconscious for several minutes, and again I felt myself being flung forward, and I sort of regained consciousness, like a sort of television tuning in, and I was hanging out of the gate, sort of trapped at the waist, and there was this copper trying to pull me out. I mean, it's a miracle of physics that because I've been unconscious, so there's nothing I could do to help myself, that I'd somehow ended up hanging out of the gate rather than against. Yard either way, they've been against the fence, and I wouldn't be talking to you now.
Obviously, it was a very strange time. I mean, we had arranged that night that we were heading back to the railway pub in Formby. That was where we always used to meet after games. Obviously, it was before the days of mobile phones and things like that. So just heading home from Hillsborough, the first thing I can remember is we stopped at a services somewhere, and that was so that we could all queue up and make phone calls. So that was when I was able to let my mum and dad know that I was okay. Tim didn't come home at that point, didn't know what had happened to him, so I came home, sat next to an empty seat. When we got back to Formby, because the plan was that we were all going to, the plan was we were going to meet up in the railway to celebrate. So headed to the railway to try and find out what had happened to people. Got in here and the group of friends were in here, but obviously there was people missing. Part of it, one of my friends then drove me to Tim's house because I had to go, I felt as though I had to go and see his mum and dad and talk to them. And luckily when we got there, they'd just had a phone call from a hospital in Sheffield saying that Tim was there and that he was all right.
We got put on a police bus which drove us to a disused boys club, a social services building, and I was assigned a social worker, and I got in his car and he drove me to this quiet side street where there was a phone box, and from there I rang my parents, and obviously they were relieved. When we got back home on the night, my younger brother told me that my friend Chris Devonside had been killed, and so on the Monday we went round to see his parents, and I'll never forget Barry. I mean, still friends with Barry and Jackie to this day, but never forget it. The first thing he said to us, "We've made up that you lads got out."
Over the past few years, tragedy chanting has become a real problem in English football, and there have been many incidents of tragedy chanting being aimed at Liverpool fans, both at Anfield and further afield too.
When I first started going to football, it was in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and it was at a time where Liverpool and Man United, obviously always big rivals, and at those games I can always remember the Munich chanting went on. There's 2 or 3 different songs that were sang a lot, and I was probably a 10, 11, 12-year-old. Munich had happened 12 years before I was even born, didn't really understand it, didn't really understand what it was, and that kind of thing happened. Suddenly Hillsborough comes along and happens, and actually is your eye-opener to what is important in the world. And I think from a personal point of view, you suddenly think, how did we stand there and sing those songs? But B, those songs then completely stopped at Anfield. I've never ever heard it again. I'm not saying it's never happened, but I've certainly never heard it.
I think that the pandemic and lockdown had a sort of very strange effect on people. Obviously for a year or more they couldn't get into grounds, and it was the worst of it was that season, the first season that the grounds were open again after the pandemic. It seemed that everybody was, well, not quite everybody. I mean, there are clubs with good fans like Brighton and Crystal Palace who just they don't sing any sort of abuse. They just support their own team, which is as it should be. But it seemed for that season that most groups of fans were doing it, and it's just some sort of post-lockdown release. I don't know what it was.
There was very little of it to start with, but I think over the years it's gradually started coming into the game, and now you hear it on such a frequent basis. Obviously at Liverpool, the common one that's sung is always "The victim's never your fault." And I think in terms of, for that, the impact that I know how I feel about it as a survivor, but the impact that must have on the families, when you see and understand how hard they fought to get those rulings that actually people were to blame, and that it wasn't down to their own behaviour. How they must feel about those songs is beyond me.
You highlight these things, and it stops them. It's when it's not highlighted that it just festers.
Do you think that the Premier League or the FA or maybe some of the clubs could do more to prevent or discourage it? Or
Absolutely, but I don't think Liverpool have done enough. They should be cutting allocations of, or even sort of home fans only. If this particular club can't stop their they will not get tickets. And all right, whichever the club could do a tit for tat. Well, we're not selling Liverpool fans any tickets, but it would highlight it. But I think it's something that football needs to deal with, because it's absolutely a football problem. I mean, things like you still get things like racism and homophobia, but they're societal issues. And football reflects wider society. But the bereaved, the traumatised, they don't get abuse outside football.
There's been banter and there's been chanting that's been inappropriate for many years, but the tragic chanting around Hillsborough and has come from so many different groups of fans over the last, let's say, 10 years. And the HSA, and again, I'm going to say HSA, but Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. I mean, Nottingham Forest have been amazing when they got promoted to the Premiership. The first time they came to Anfield, they came with a banner that they'd made that said "No to tragedy chanting." That's not to say that they still haven't got an element in their fan base that will still do it. But when you've got other clubs that are standing up and making a standpoint on it, and look, Liverpool have sadly got their own track record of tragedy chanting. Back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, Liverpool fans would sing about the events that happened in Munich in 1958. No one's proud of that. No one's going to say it didn't happen, because it did happen. And lots of Man United fans will then go, "You only stopped doing it after Hillsborough and Heysel." Maybe they're right, but it doesn't make it right that should continue into 2024, 2025.
what message would you give to any Hillsborough survivors watching?
So I think it's a combination of don't ignore it, and be open to the fact that actually anything that you're going through now that may not seem linked to it can be linked to it. Be aware that actually just because you've lived a normal life for however long you've lived, you could still be dealing with stuff that internally that you don't realise, and be open to all the help that you can get.
I'd say be proud of yourself. You went through something that, well, very few people go through a disaster in any shape or form, but we are the only ones who were roundly blamed for causing what nearly killed us. And we faced so much lies, so much abuse, that if anybody who's come through that and is still, a decent, functioning human being, well, you've got something to be proud of.
Someone thinks they've got an issue, or they want to talk about it, and they've maybe never talked about it in the past. It's funny talking about it with people who understand it because they were there. It's it helps ratify all those strange feelings that we've all had in our heads. Survivor's guilt. What if I had a ticket to stand in the Leppins Lane and I switched it for £5 to sit? And that's the thing in my head that always goes, well, what if, and whatever happened to the ticket that I had in my hand that I swapped? I can't ever answer those questions, but being able to talk about it with people who had similar experiences and similar views just makes you just settle a little bit easier, settle a bit easier.